So we've been talking about or assuming the short run up to now, but now let's think about the long run. If we remember what the long run means, it refers to a situation where all of the inputs that are used in the production process are now variable. All of them can be changed. As opposed to the short run where there was at least one input which was fixed in quantity. Alright, so in this case we're talking about where a firm is planning to increase its scale. It's planning to build new factories and employ labour in those factories, thereby increasing its output. Now, since all of the inputs are variable, there are no fixed inputs and therefore no fixed costs. So when we talk about the cost curves in the long run, we don't have any fixed cost curves. There is just the average total cost curve, and we can add in a marginal cost curve if we like. Now, one of the interesting things that happens when the firm changes its scale is that the short run average cost curves will shift, and they will shift, according to our theory, in a certain way. There's a certain pattern to how they will shift. So before we look at that, let's think about the impact on average costs of increasing the scale of operations. First, we can say that as a firm increases its scale, it's possible that it could enjoy what are called internal economies of scale. Internal economies of scale here means that due to the change in scale, the change in size of the firm itself, internally, it's able to decrease its average costs of production. Why would its average cost of production fall as the firm increases its scale and therefore is able to produce more at different costs? Well, one is that increasing the scale of operations can increase the productivity of the input units used. That is, each of the inputs is able to produce more than it could before. The input relative to output, or the output relative to inputs increases. Why would that be the case? Well, it could be that as the firm becomes larger, it is able to take advantage of the division of labour. That is, each of the workers employed in the firm specialises in particular tasks or particular operations in the production of a product. So you'll have some workers who are devoted exclusively to operating at a particular point on the production line, such as shown in the picture there. You'll have some workers who are devoted exclusively to loading inputs or raw materials off the back dock of the factory. You'll have other workers who are specifically devoted to cleaning up. You'll have other workers who are specifically devoted to packaging, others specifically devoted to marketing, others specifically devoted to accounting, and so on. And because of that, because each worker becomes very specialized in the task that they perform, it's usually the case that that worker is able to contribute more to production, to output, than would otherwise have been the case if they weren't specialised, if everyone was just a jack of all trades and everyone was contributing to all parts of the production process. So by specialising in a particular task, a worker becomes very good at that task and is able to increase their output simply by virtue of them specialising. Another reason why there might be an improvement in productivity is that some of the byproducts utilised or byproducts produced by the production process, when there's a sufficient quantity of them, they can themselves become products. And so the inputs into the production process, some of those inputs, which for a smaller size business would be waste, become output for a larger size business. So if we take the example of a cow, for a small slaughterhouse, for example, they might take certain parts of the cow and there'll be a lot of waste left over. But as the slaughterhouse becomes a larger and larger abattoir, all of the inputs, all of the what was previously waste can be gathered together and sold as a product in itself. So organs and glands, for example, various organs and glands and bones and so on, hide and all of that, for a small abattoir is just waste, it's just thrown away. But for a very large abattoir, those organs, glands and hide, hair and bones and horns can all be packaged up, so to speak, and sold as a product in itself, thereby increasing the productivity of the carcass. That's a pretty awful kind of example, but there you go. Also, as a firm becomes larger, it can better utilize it can more fully utilize the capital that it has purchased. So you can imagine, for example, a smaller firm might have purchased some computer equipment, and if it's producing only a small amount, it doesn't utilize that computer equipment to the maximum capacity possible. But as the firm grows, as its scale increases, it can utilize that computer equipment more fully. It doesn't have to buy new computer equipment. It just more fully utilizes the capital equipment that it already has. So we can say that on average, that capital equipment, that computer software, although it hasn't increased in quantity, it's producing more than it did before. That is, its quote-unquote productivity has increased. Another contributor to internal economies of scale, which sometimes isn't talked about in textbooks, is that as a firm becomes larger, this might have an impact on the prices that the firm pays for its inputs. So it might be the case that as a firm becomes much, much larger, it has greater bargaining power in the purchase of its raw materials. So it buys in bulk, for example, and therefore can get a discount from its supplier. Whereas a smaller size firm, a smaller scale firm, buys relatively small amounts of raw materials, and therefore it can't get that discount for buying in bulk, so to speak. Also, it's possible, although this isn't guaranteed, it's possible that a firm that becomes larger, if that firm starts to dominate a particular sub-labor market for certain kinds of skills, for a certain kind of job, so that there aren't many other employers who are hiring people for a certain kind of job, it's possible that the employer can gain greater bargaining power over the wages it has to pay to its workers who have certain skills. If the workers with those certain skills don't have somewhere else to go, they don't have some other employer that they could shift to who would pay higher wages, then the firm knows that it could push down the wages that it offers to those employees, and they really wouldn't have much choice other than to accept those lower wages. So, as the firm increases its scale, it's possible that it has greater bargaining power over wages and could decrease the price of the labour input. And finally, as a firm becomes larger, it can often have some degree of bargaining power over the cost of finance. So, for example, a very small corner store business might want to expand its business a little bit by building some more shelves or something like that. It might go to the bank and get a loan. The bank will offer a standard business loan with a certain interest rate. But if it's a very large business, it could, and it intends to borrow a lot of money to build whole new factories, then it's possible that when it goes to the bank, it can bargain with the bank over the interest rate that it has to pay. And so it could end up paying a lower interest rate than on its loans to expand its business compared to a smaller business. So again, as the firm becomes larger, it's possible that the price of the purchase of capital, that is the interest it has to pay on a loan, falls. Now, because of all of those things combined, or some combination of them, we would say that as a firm gets larger, that is, as it starts to produce more and more output, its short-run average costs will shift. First, it'll produce more, so it'll be moving this way, but its average cost curves will shift downwards, like this. So, then, we can see the effect on average costs in the long run of these internal economies of scale, because the firm will now have a choice of costs that are the lowest points on these short-run average cost curves. It's not going to worry about these parts of the cost curve that are above the lowest points, because it obviously wouldn't choose to remain at this scale and pay a higher cost compared to increasing its scale, having lower costs, and producing at a lower average cost for the same output. So we would say that in the long run, its average cost curve would be any of these points here. Or, if we wanted to make it nice and smooth, we could have a long-run average cost curve which is downward sloping like this, reflecting the fact that as the scale increases, and therefore it produces more, the average cost of production falls. Okay. But that's not the end of the story, because there's the mirror image of that. It's possible that as a firm becomes larger and becomes, quote-unquote, too big for its boots, so to speak, it could start to experience internal diseconomies of scale. That is, rising average costs by virtue of becoming larger. So what could cause that? Well, again, if we look at the productivity of inputs, as a firm becomes much larger, it's possible that its workers, who have become highly specialized in very particular tasks, so we divide there's a division of labor between all sorts of different tasks that end up producing a car or whatever. We might find that workers who are very specialized in very particular tasks become bored, so to speak, with the kinds of tasks that they're engaged in, and will start to find ways of minimizing the amount of work that they have to do in the day. So there might be this, what we could call labor, and let's give it a fancy term, labor alienation, where workers become bored and have little existential crises about, where their life is going and why are they doing what they're doing. so that their productivity falls. They don't work as hard, and they find ways of shirking. That means that for any given unit of labour, it's producing as the firm becomes larger, the workers become more alienated, then the productivity, the amount produced by each worker, falls, which contributes to average costs starting to rise. It's also possible that as a firm becomes larger, especially if we're talking about production, we're talking about factories, manufacturing in particular, where there are long production lines and there's a high degree of interdependence along that production line, which means that every step on the production line depends on every previous step going smoothly and exactly according to plan. But of course, the more steps you add to a production line, the greater the level of interdependency with respect to the very last stage. So anything, the more steps you add before you get to the last stage, the more chance is that something will go wrong, and therefore production, the whole production line would stop until that problem is rectified, and then the production line can continue again. Now, so it means that as the firm becomes larger, the production line independencies become larger, so it's possible that problems arise at the probability of a problem arising at any given point increases, and therefore the chances of production slowing down for some period of time increases as well. So average costs can go up for that reason. And lucky last, as a firm becomes larger, it develops its own kind of bureaucracy, its own middle management bureaucracy, and middle management bureaucracy has a tendency to generate more bureaucracy. So it finds things for itself to do that aren't inherently related to the production of the product. In fact, that they can slow down production by adding more and more layers of bureaucracy, which can increase the costs of production as the firm gets larger and becomes more bureaucratic. It's also possible that the prices of inputs could be influenced, that is, could rise because of a firm becoming larger and larger. So as firms become larger, especially if we're talking about industrial production, where you have masses of workers all producing the same sort of thing, all having the same sorts of experiences, all working under the same conditions, in those cases it's more likely, or it used to be more likely, that workers would band together and form a union, and then as a union they would bargain for higher wages. And they could use the threat of work slowdowns and strikes in order to try and achieve higher wages in the bargaining process. Therefore, as the firm becomes larger, it's possible that its workforce can become unionized, and when its workforce become unionized, they can bargain for higher wages, and therefore costs would rise, average cost of production would rise. And also, as a firm becomes larger, it might develop a management that is able to engage in what we could call rent seeking. That is, the management itself will start to pay itself higher wages or higher salaries and bonuses and so on that are unrelated to the production process, but are simply related to the fact that the management, for some reason or other, can get away with paying itself higher wages because it becomes disconnected from the owners of the business, that is, shareholders who don't know really what's going on, and can be tricked into thinking that paying higher wages is somehow beneficial when it's not, or they won't realize that this is occurring, or they don't have they can't organize themselves into voting blocks to prevent management from paying itself higher wages in a way that's unrelated to production. Again, this can cause costs of production to rise as the firm gets larger. So when we represent that idea graphically, we would say that the short-run average cost curves, although they're moving to the right as the firm produces more, they increase, they shift upwards. And if we wanted to take a nice, so that means that every point, the lowest point on these cost curves, so ignore this now, this red line here, the lowest points on the cost curve will be the long-run average costs. So we can make a nice smooth curve in that way. And so we've got this long-run average cost curve, this blue long-run average cost curve, that shows as the firm's getting larger, it can take advantage of the economies of scale, productivity of labour increases, and the prices of inputs might increase. But at some point, as the firm becomes quote-unquote too large, so to speak, it starts to experience decreases in the productivity of its inputs and increases in the prices of some of its inputs, which cause average costs, the cost per unit of output, to rise. So that would be the shape, well, that's a conceivable shape of the long-run average cost curve. It should be borne in mind that some economists argue that this is not accurate, and that in fact you could have a long-run average cost curve which might initially be downward sloping, showing diseconomies of scale, but it doesn't experience it experiences internal economies of scale, but it doesn't experience internal diseconomies of scale. So some economists argue that this is really a theoretical fiction in many cases, in which case the average cost curve, long-run average cost curve, would become flat. It would just keep going along this way. This would be the long-run average cost curve. Okay, that'll do for now.